At first there was no calm, a restless world turning through darkness, its surface never still, its sky thick with ash and fire, a place where land melted as often as it formed, where nothing held its shape long enough to be called permanent or safe at all times then. This was Earth before memory, before quiet oceans or steady skies, when impacts from space struck without warning, reshaping everything in moments, leaving scars that vanished beneath new layers of heat, as if the planet refused to remember its own past, or was never allowed to keep it for long. Oceans tried to exist, gathering in low places only to boil away under relentless heat, returning again in cycles that felt uncertain, as though water itself could not decide whether it belonged here, while clouds formed and dissolved in a sky that offered no promise of stability at all times. The ground beneath Motske solid, continents drifting like fragments that never agreed on where to settle, pulled and broken by forces beneath them, rising and sinking without pattern, creating a surface that felt temporary. Nothing moved with intention, nothing paused to stabilize, every force acting without awareness, pushing and pulling in ways that collided rather than aligned, creating a world where balance was not absent by accident, but never present to begin with, a place defined by motion without direction at any given time. If someone could have stood there, which they could not, they would have found no stable horizon, no familiar rhythm, only constant change unfolding in every direction, a landscape that shifted even as it was observed, making the idea of permanence feel like something that had never existed at all. And yet, when this restless world is compared to the Earth known today, something feels almost impossible to accept, because the calm we experience now suggests a history of stability, while the truth hidden beneath it points to a beginning where stability had no place to form at any time. The contrast is quiet but unsettling, because it asks a question that does not easily fade. How did something so unstable become something that appears so steady? And more importantly, why did the chaos not continue forever, as every sign in those early conditions suggests it should have at all? The answer does not arrive here, not yet. Instead, the narration lingers on the feeling that something is missing from the picture, something that has not been revealed, a quiet shift that must have taken place without leaving a clear trace behind for anyone to easily find, at any find. Because by every expectation, by every pattern seen in those violent beginnings, this world should have remained locked in instability, unable to settle, unable to calm, continuing endlessly in cycles of destruction and renewal that never moved toward anything resembling balance or quiet continuity as time moved forward without end. And still, that is not what happened, which is where the unease deepens, because the Earth did not remain chaotic. It did not continue drifting without direction. Instead, it changed slowly and quietly in ways that are difficult to trace, as if the shift itself preferred to remain hidden there. No single moment marks this change, no clear event announces it. The chaos does not suddenly stop, but something within it begins to organize almost imperceptibly, as if patterns are forming beneath the surface, guiding the same forces that once collided into something that now begins to align over time. And that is where the story quietly turns, not by explaining what caused this shift, but by allowing the question to settle into the mind. What force or what process could take a world that should never have stabilized and begin to guide it toward balance without ever revealing itself? Nothing on this early Earth was guiding itself toward balance, and yet everything was in motion, driven by forces that did not know what they were shaping. Gravity pulled without intention, drawing matter inward, holding fragments together, while at the same time allowing them to break apart under pressure that built from deep within. Heat rose from below, relentless and constant, forcing the surface to crack, to melt, to shift again and again, as though the planet could not settle because something inside it refused to grow quiet. Pressure built silently beneath layers of rock, only to release itself in sudden ruptures, sending material upward in violent bursts that reshaped the land in moments, only for those changes to be undone just as quickly by something else waiting to act. Above, the sky offered no stability either, shaped by influences far beyond the planet itself. Impacts arrived without warning, fragments from space colliding with the surface, each one altering the course of what had just begun to form, as if no process was allowed to continue uninterrupted. The atmosphere thickened, thinned, shifted, reacting to changes below and above, but never in a way that suggested coordination. Everything responded, but nothing planned. Everything moved, but nothing aimed. It would be easy to imagine that all of this was completely random, a series of disconnected reactions unfolding without pattern, each force acting independently, unaware of the others. Volcanoes erupted not because they should, but because pressure demanded release. Continents shifted not because they were guided, but because they were pushed and pulled by movements beneath them. Oceans formed where they could, vanished when they must, never holding their place long enough to feel permanent. Each process appeared isolated, each event separate, creating the impression of a world defined only by disorder. And yet when this chaos is observed not for a moment but across time, something begins to feel different. The eruptions, though violent, do not happen without rhythm. The shifting of land, though unpredictable in the moment, follows paths that begin to repeat. The atmosphere, though unstable, moves through cycles that echo earlier states. These are not precise patterns, not controlled or designed, but they are not entirely without consistency either. They return, in altered forms, again and again, as though something beneath the randomness is quietly repeating itself. This is where the unease begins to grow, because repetition suggests something more than chance. Yet nothing in these forces appears capable of creating intention. There is no guiding hand, no awareness shaping outcomes, only processes reacting to conditions, each one responding in isolation. And still, those responses begin to resemble something that feels almost familiar, almost structured, even if no structure was ever meant to exist. The mind searches for meaning in these repetitions, but none is given. The forces do not explain themselves. Gravity does not choose, heat does not decide, pressure does not consider what comes next. They act because they must, following conditions that arise without planning, creating results that seem to build upon one another without ever being designed to do so. And so a quiet question forms, not spoken, but felt. If everything here is truly without direction, if every force acts without awareness, then why do these patterns continue to appear, again and again, as though the chaos is slowly beginning to echo itself? The answer does not arrive, not yet instead. The narration lingers in this uncertainty, allowing the idea to settle that perhaps what looks like disorder is not entirely without form. That perhaps, given enough time, even the most unpredictable processes begin to align in ways that feel less like coincidence and more like something quietly repeating beneath the surface. Not controlled, not guided, but not entirely without shape either. And as this thought begins to take hold, the story moves forward, drawn toward a deeper question that cannot be ignored for long, whether these emerging patterns are simply the result of endless repetition, or if they are the first signs of something larger beginning to form, something that has not yet revealed what it is becoming. At first, nothing announces the change. There is no sudden silence, no dramatic shift where chaos gives way to calm. The same forces continue to act, the same eruptions break the surface, the same heat rises from below, and yet something within these movements begins to feel different, not in what happens, but in how it repeats over time. The cycles that once seemed scattered now return with a faint sense of familiarity, as though the planet is beginning to echo itself in ways that were not there before. Temperatures still rise and fall, but not as wildly as before, holding within a narrower range, as if some unseen boundary is slowly forming. Oceans appear again, but this time they linger a little longer, resisting the forces that once erased them so quickly. The atmosphere shifts, but its changes begin to follow paths that resemble earlier states, returning not exactly as they were, but close enough to suggest a quiet consistency. These are not dramatic transformations, not events that demand attention, but subtle adjustments that require patience to notice, like a whisper carried through noise. Nothing about this suggests control. There is no guiding presence shaping these outcomes, no external force correcting the system. The same blind processes continue, acting without awareness, and yet their interactions begin to soften, colliding less violently, aligning just enough to reduce the constant destruction that once defined everything. It is not that chaos disappears, but that it begins to interact with itself differently, creating space for something else to emerge. The change is so gradual that it could easily be missed. There is no moment where instability ends and stability begins. Instead, there is a slow shift in how the planet behaves, a tendency toward repetition that grows stronger over time. Patterns that once appeared briefly now last longer. Interactions that once destroyed now sometimes preserve. And in these small differences, something begins to take shape, not as a fixed state, but as a direction, This is where the realization begins to form, not all at once, but slowly, as the mind tries to understand what is being observed. The planet is not becoming stable because something is stabilizing it. There is no intervention, no external correction, guiding it toward balance. Instead, the processes themselves are beginning to produce stability, not intentionally, but as a result of how they interact. The idea feels almost impossible at first because it suggests that balance can emerge without being designed, that a system with no awareness, no intention, can begin to regulate itself simply through the repetition of its own processes. The chaos that once defined the planet does not vanish, but it starts to organize, not because it chooses to, but because over time, certain patterns persist while others fade. This changes everything. What once appeared as endless disorder now feels like the beginning of something else, something that was not obvious when seen in isolation. Each eruption, each shift, each cycle is no longer just an event, but part of a larger pattern that is slowly connecting, forming relationships that extend beyond single moments. The planet is not escaping chaos, it is using it, shaping it into something that resembles balance without ever intending to do so. And yet this realization brings with it a deeper question, one that does not settle easily. If there is no guiding force, no awareness behind these changes, then how can such a system begin to regulate itself at all? Answer remains out of reach, hidden within the interactions that continue to unfold, leaving behind only the quiet sense that something fundamental is taking place. Something that transforms chaos not into order, but into the foundation from which order can quietly emerge over time. At first, the changes seem simple, almost too ordinary to notice. A shift in heat here, a movement in the air there, a slight alteration in the way water gathers and spreads across the surface. Nothing appears connected, nothing suggests coordination, and yet when these changes are observed over time, something begins to link them together in quiet and unexpected ways. Heat rises from the surface, warming the atmosphere above it, causing the air to expand and move, carrying particles across the sky. Those particles, in turn, begin to affect how heat is held or released, altering the temperature once again. The oceans respond to this change, absorbing warmth, redistributing it, and slowly releasing it back into the air, influencing the same atmosphere that shaped them in the first place. Each step seems simple on its own, a straightforward reaction to conditions that exist in the moment, but the sequence does not end there. What begins as a single cause becomes part of a chain that circles back, returning to where it started, but not in the same way. The heat that once rose now returns in a different form. The atmosphere that once shifted now shapes the very conditions that caused it to move. The oceans that absorbed energy now release it, altering the cycle that continues to repeat. It is not a straight line of cause and effect, but something that bends back on itself, forming a loop that quietly sustains its own motion. No one directs this. Nothing within the system is aware of what it is doing, and yet the result begins to resemble something that feels almost intentional. The temperature does not rise endlessly, nor does it fall without limit. Instead, it begins to settle within a range, shifting but not collapsing. The atmosphere does not drift into chaos indefinitely. It adjusts, redistributing energy in ways that prevent extremes from lasting too long. The oceans do not simply absorb heat until they can hold no more. They release it, balancing the exchange in ways that feel measured, even though no measurement exists. The realization forms slowly, not as a sudden insight, but as a growing awareness that these processes are not isolated. They are connected, each one influencing the others, each one responding to changes that it helped create. The planet is not just reacting to forces acting upon it, it is beginning to respond to itself. This is where the shift becomes difficult to ignore, because response alone suggests nothing unusual. Any system can react to change, but what is happening here feels different. The responses do not simply follow the changes, they begin to influence future conditions, shaping what comes next. The system is not just moving forward, it is circling back, adjusting as it goes, creating outcomes that reduce. And yet there is still no awareness, no guiding force behind any of it. The planet does not know what it is doing. It does not recognize imbalance, nor does it aim to correct it. And still, the patterns begin to produce something that looks very much like correction. Not perfect, not precise, but consistent enough to suggest that something deeper is unfolding beneath the surface. The idea lingers, quiet but persistent. How can something without intention begin to behave as though it is maintaining itself? The answer is not given, not yet. Instead, the narration allows the pattern to remain as it is, incomplete but undeniable, a system of interactions that continues to loop, to adjust, to respond in ways that feel less like coincidence with each passing cycle. And as these loops grow more visible, more intertwined, the question deepens, because what began as simple reactions is starting to resemble something far more complex, something that may not exist in isolation, but as part of a larger system, one where countless processes connect, overlap, and influence one another in ways that are only just beginning to be seen. At first, each process seemed to exist on its own, acting without connection, shaping the planet in isolation. Heat rose, oceans formed and vanished, the atmosphere shifted, and the land beneath fractured and reformed, each movement unfolding without regard for the others. But over time, these separate actions begin to overlap, not by design, but simply because they cannot avoid one another. The atmosphere no longer changes alone. It is influenced by the oceans beneath it, carrying heat and moisture upward, while also shaping how that same heat returns to the surface. The oceans respond in turn, adjusting to the air above them, redistributing energy across vast distances, altering conditions far from where those changes began. Beneath it all, the ground continues to move, lifting land, sinking it, releasing heat that feeds into both ocean and sky, connecting processes that once appeared unrelated. No single part leads, no force decides how the others should behave, and yet through constant interaction, something begins to emerge that feels different from the chaos that came before. The same forces that once disrupted everything now begin to influence one another in ways that soften their extremes. Heat that would have built endlessly is carried away. Pressure that would have shattered the surface is released in ways that spread its impact. Movements that once collided now begin to intersect in patterns that reduce their intensity, not eliminating disruption, but redistributing it. This does not happen all at once. There is no moment where disorder transforms into order. Instead, there is a gradual shift, a slow alignment of interactions, where processes that once worked against each other begin, almost unintentionally, to work with one another. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to change the overall behavior of the system. The planet is still active, still restless, but its movements begin to feel less destructive and more interconnected. Changes ripple outward rather than explode outward. Energy moves through the system instead of remaining trapped within it. What once built toward collapse now disperses, creating space for stability to form, even if only temporarily. And this is where the realization begins to deepen, because it becomes clear that stability is not replacing chaos. Chaos is still there, present in every movement, in every shift, in every change that continues to unfold. The difference is not in its absence, but in how it behaves. The system does not remove disorder, it absorbs it, distributes it, and in doing so transforms it into something that no longer destroys everything in its path. This is the paradox that quietly takes shape. The balance that is beginning to form does not exist despite chaos, but because of it, without constant change, without movement, without the very forces that once made the planet unstable, there would be no way for the system to adjust, no way for it to respond, no way for it to maintain itself over time. Stillness would not create stability. It would end it. The idea settles slowly, almost reluctantly, because it challenges what feels intuitive. Stability is often imagined as calm, as the absence of disruption, as something that resists change. But here, the opposite begins to appear true. The system remains stable only because it continues to change, only because the same forces that once threatened it are still active, still interacting, still shaping outcomes in ways that prevent extremes from taking hold. Nothing has been removed. Nothing has been silenced. The chaos remains, but it no longer acts alone. And in that interaction, in that constant exchange between forces that do not know what they are creating, a balance begins to hold, fragile and shifting, yet persistent enough to continue, which leads to a quieter, more unsettling thought. If this balance depends on such constant interaction, if it relies on forces that never stop moving, never stop changing, then how stable can it truly be? and how close does it remain to becoming unstable once again? From a distance, the system now appears steady, its movements repeating with enough consistency to suggest that something lasting has formed. Oceans return and remain. The atmosphere shifts within limits. The land continues to move but no longer dissolves into constant destruction. There is rhythm where once there was only collision. And in that rhythm, the idea of stability begins to take hold. But this stability is not what it seems. It does not rest on something solid or unchanging. It is not anchored in permanence. Instead, it exists in motion, held together by processes that must continue without pause. Every balance depends on interaction. Every equilibrium depends on constant adjustment. And the moment that movement slows or shifts too far, the entire system begins to feel the strain. The calm is real, but it is not secure. Small changes ripple through everything. A slight increase in heat does not remain isolated. It moves into the atmosphere, altering its behavior, which in turn affects the oceans, which then return that influence back to the surface. Each change builds upon another, not always in ways that are easy to predict. What begins as a minor shift can grow, spreading through the system, amplifying in some places, diminishing in others, creating outcomes that are larger than their origins. And yet, most of the time these changes do not lead to collapse. They are absorbed, redirected, balanced by other processes that respond in turn. The system bends rather than breaks, adjusting just enough to keep itself within a range where stability can continue. But this adjustment is not guaranteed. It is not precise. It happens because of countless interactions overlapping at once, each one influencing the others in ways that cannot be fully traced. This is what makes the balance feel me. Not because it is weak, but because it is dependent. It relies on relationships that must remain active, on processes that must continue to respond, on interactions that must remain connected. If too many of these relationships shift at once, if too many processes begin to move in the same direction without opposition, the system could tip, not gradually, but suddenly. The possibility is always there, just beneath the surface. The planet has not escaped chaos. It has learned to exist alongside it, to contain it within limits that can shift but not collapse. But those limits are not fixed. They move, they stretch, they adjust, and sometimes they come closer to breaking than they appear. And still, something prevents that break from happening completely. Time and again, changes rise. Pressure builds, conditions shift, and yet the system finds a way to respond, to redistribute, to adjust before the edge is crossed. It is not perfect, not without disruption, but it endures in a way that feels almost improbable given how easily it could fail. This is where the quiet mystery begins to deepen. Because the forces involved have already been seen. Heat, pressure, movement, interaction, all of them are known, all of them acting without awareness, without intention. And yet, together, they create a system that holds itself together against conditions that should, by all expectations, pull it apart. It is not obvious why this works. Nothing in these processes suggests that they should be capable of maintaining such balance over time, especially when the system remains so sensitive to change. And yet, the balance persists, not as something fixed, but as something that continues. Moment by moment, adjustment after adjustment, never fully secure, but never fully lost, which leads to a quieter, more unsettling thought. What if this balance is not held together by physical forces alone? What if something else, something not yet visible in the system, is part of what allows it to endure, shaping the outcome without ever appearing as a force on its own? Nothing announces its arrival. There is no sudden shift in the sky, no change in the movement of the land, no visible sign that anything new has begun. The same cycles continue, heat rising, oceans shifting, the atmosphere adjusting, everything moving as it always has. And yet, within this ongoing motion, something begins to happen so quietly that it almost escapes notice entirely. Small interactions start to repeat, not in the same way as before, not as part of the larger patterns that shaped the planet, but on a scale so fine that it exists beneath everything else. Tiny combinations of matter come together, separate, and then come together again, forming structures that last just a little longer than expected. Most vanish almost immediately, undone by the same forces that dominate the surface, but a few return, not identical, but close enough to suggest a kind of persistence. It is easy to overlook. These formations do not reshape the planet. They do not influence the vast systems of heat and pressure. They exist in fragile spaces, in moments where conditions allow them to remain just long enough to repeat. They are weak, easily disrupted, and surrounded by forces far greater than themselves. By all expectations, they should not last. And yet, they do. Again and again, these small patterns appear, disappear, and then return, as if something within them allows them to continue, even when everything around them remains unstable. There is no intention behind this repetition, no awareness guiding it, and still it continues quietly, persistently, without drawing attention to itself. The planet does not notice. The vast systems of atmosphere and ocean continue their cycles, unaffected by these tiny interactions. The land shifts, the heat rises, the sky changes, all of it unfolding without regard for what is happening on this smaller scale. And yet within that indifference something new begins to take hold, something that does not rely on force or size, but on the simple ability to continue. This is where the change begins to deepen, because persistence, even at the smallest scale, introduces something the planet has not yet experienced. Until now, everything has been defined by movement and reaction, by forces acting and responding, shaping outcomes without carrying anything forward. But these small interactions begin to do something different. They repeat not just as events, but as sequences carrying a form of continuity from one moment to the next. It is not stability in the way the larger systems create it. It does not balance heat or pressure. It does not regulate the atmosphere or reshape the land. But it introduces a new kind of consistency, one that exists not in the environment, but within the process itself. And this changes the nature of the system, even if the change is almost impossible to see. Because for the first time, something is not just reacting to conditions, it is continuing through them. The realization does not arrive all at once. It forms slowly as these small patterns persist longer, as they begin to appear more frequently, as though they are finding ways to remain within a world that should not allow them to exist. They are still fragile, still easily erased, but their return becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. And this is where the question begins to shift. Not toward what these formations are, but toward what they might become. Because even in their weakness, even in their near invisibility, they introduce something that has not been part of the system before, a form of persistence that does not depend on controlling the environment, but on existing within it, repeating, continuing, quietly enduring. And in that endurance, something unexpected begins to emerge. These small, fragile processes are not separate from the system that surrounds them. They exist within it, shaped by it, and yet in their persistence they begin to interact with it in ways that are not immediately clear. They do not dominate, they do not control, but they remain, and that alone may be enough to change everything. Because if something so small can continue in a world that was never stable, then perhaps stability itself is not only shaped by the largest forces, but also by the smallest ones, working quietly beneath the surface, influencing the system in ways that have not yet been fully understood. At first, these fragile patterns seem too small to matter, too easily erased to leave any lasting mark on a world still governed by immense forces. They persist, but quietly, almost hidden beneath the larger movements of heat, pressure, and shifting land. Nothing about them suggests influence. Nothing about them appears capable of changing anything beyond their immediate surroundings. And yet, over time, something begins to accumulate. The same small processes that repeat begin to leave traces behind. Not large, not sudden, but enough to remain after the moment has passed. Tiny changes linger in the environment, altering conditions ever so slightly. What was once neutral becomes altered. What once reacted in one way begins to respond in another. These changes are subtle, almost impossible to detect at first, but they do not disappear. They build, the environment begins to shift, not because of a single event, but because of countless small interactions layering upon one another. The atmosphere carries new elements that were not there before. The waters hold substances that slowly change how they behave. Surfaces that once reacted in predictable ways begin to respond differently, as though something within them has been quietly adjusted. Nothing dramatic happens. There are no sudden transformations, no visible signs that the world is being reshaped. The planet still moves as it always has. The same cycles continue. the same forces remain in motion. But beneath those familiar patterns, the conditions themselves begin to change, guided not by the large systems alone, but by something smaller, something persistent. Life does not take control. It does not spread rapidly or dominate the environment. It remains fragile, limited, existing only where conditions allow it to survive. And yet within those limits, it begins to influence what surrounds it, not by force but by presence. Each repetition leaves behind a trace. Each trace contributes to a shift, and those shifts begin to alter the very conditions that made those repetitions possible. This is where the change becomes difficult to ignore, because the relationship is no longer one-sided. The planet shapes life, determining where it can exist, how long it can persist, and under what conditions it can continue. But now, life begins to shape the planet in return, not in large or obvious ways, but through countless small adjustments that gradually alter the system itself. The environment is no longer just a stage on which processes unfold. It becomes something that is being quietly modified from within. The interaction forms a loop. Conditions allow life to exist. Life alters those conditions. The altered conditions then influence how life continues. Each part feeds into the other, not by design, not through intention, but through the simple fact that they cannot exist independently anymore. What happens in one place begins to affect what happens elsewhere, not immediately, but over time. And in that time, the effects begin to grow. The changes remain subtle, but they are no longer isolated. They connect, overlap, and extend beyond their origin, creating patterns that were not present before. The system begins to behave differently, not because its core forces have changed, but because the conditions those forces act upon are no longer the same. This is the moment where the realization begins to settle. The balance of the planet is no longer shaped by physical processes alone. There is something else now, something that participates in the system without controlling it, something that influences outcomes without directing them. Life does not replace the forces that shape the Earth, but it becomes part of how those forces interact, part of how the system responds to itself. The idea feels unfamiliar. A world once defined only by blind processes now includes something that persists, something that accumulates, something that alters conditions in ways that feed back into the system, not as a separate layer, not as an addition, but as something woven into the same interactions that maintain balance. And yet, nothing about this is planned. There is no coordination, no awareness guiding these changes. The planet does not intend to be shaped, and life does not intend to shape it. And still, together, they begin to form a relationship that changes how the system behaves, which raises a deeper question. If life and planet are now influencing each other in ways that continue to build over time, then what kind of balance can emerge from a system that is no longer purely physical, but something more complex, something that is only just beginning to reveal what it might become? The changes are still quiet, still unfolding beneath the surface of larger movements, but they are no longer isolated. What began as small, persistent patterns has become something more integrated, something that now interacts with the planet in ways that cannot be separated from the system itself. Life is no longer just present, it is participating. The same processes continue, the shifting land, the moving atmosphere, the cycling oceans, all of them acting as they always have. But now within those processes, something else is happening. Living systems begin to take in elements from their surroundings, transform them, and release them back again, not with purpose, not with awareness, but as part of their own continuation. In doing so, they alter the very conditions they depend on. What is absorbed does not remain unchanged. What is released is not the same as what was taken. Each interaction leaves a trace, and those traces begin to shape the environment in ways that extend beyond any single moment. Substances accumulate, reactions shift, conditions adjust, and over time, these adjustments begin to influence the larger systems that once seemed untouched. It does not feel like control. Nothing in this process directs outcomes or decides what should happen next. Life does not guide the planet toward balance, and the planet does not guide life with intention, and yet together they begin to form something that behaves as though it is being guided, not by design, but by consequence. The atmosphere changes not only because of heat and pressure, but because of what is released into it. The oceans shift not only because of currents, but because of what they contain. The land itself begins to respond differently, influenced not only by internal forces but by what exists upon its surface. Each system begins to carry the influence of life within it. Even though life remains small, fragile, and easily overlooked, the interaction deepens. The planet shapes life, setting the conditions that determine where it can exist and how it can persist. But life, in turn, begins to shape those conditions, altering the environment in ways that feed back into the system. What was once a one-sided relationship becomes something more complex, something that moves in both directions at once. This is where the shift becomes undeniable. The stability of the planet is no longer something created by physical forces alone. It now includes the influence of living processes, woven into the same interactions that regulate heat, movement, and change. Life does not replace these forces, but it becomes part of how they function, part of how the system responds to itself. And in that response, something remarkable begins to take form. The balance that holds the system together is no longer external to life. It includes it. The same processes that allow life to exist are now influenced by it, creating a relationship where each depends on the other, not by choice, but by necessity. Life exists because the planet allows it, and the planet maintains its balance, in part because life continues to act within it. The idea settles slowly because it changes the meaning of everything that came before. Life is not simply an outcome of a stable planet. It is part of the reason that stability continues, not as a dominant force, not as a controlling presence, but as a participant in a system that no longer functions the same way without it. And yet this realization brings with it a question that does not easily fade. If the balance of the planet now depends, even in part, on something that continues to change, to evolve, to adapt, then what happens to that balance when life itself begins to shift beyond what the system has known before? For a time, the balance holds. The interactions between air, water, land, and life continue to repeat with enough consistency to create the sense that something lasting has formed. The system adjusts, responds, and maintains itself, not perfectly, but reliably enough that the chaos of earlier ages feels distant, almost replaced by something steadier. But the balance is not fixed. It does not rest in a final state, and it does not remain untouched. Beneath its quiet rhythm, changes continue to build, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the normal patterns of adjustment. The same processes that maintain stability begin to shift in ways that are not immediately obvious, but gradually become harder to ignore. The environment starts to fluctuate more intensely. Temperatures rise beyond their usual limits, then fall again, not settling as easily as before. The atmosphere changes in ways that alter how heat is held and released, creating conditions that feel less predictable. Oceans respond, but their responses begin to lag, no longer balancing changes as smoothly as they once did. The interactions that once softened extremes now struggle to keep them contained. Nothing collapses all at once. The system does not fail in a single moment, but it begins to strain, its adjustments becoming less precise, its responses less effective. Small disruptions grow larger, spreading further through the interconnected processes, affecting areas that were once buffered against change. And within this shifting system, life continues to act. It persists as it always has, absorbing, transforming, releasing. But now its influence begins to push the environment in new directions. The same processes that once contributed to stability begin to accumulate effects that alter conditions more dramatically. Substances build to levels that change how the atmosphere behaves. Interactions that once balanced now begin to tilt, not enough to collapse the system, but enough to disturb it. This is where the contrast becomes clear. What once helped maintain balance now begins to challenge it. Life does not intend this. It does not act with awareness or purpose. It continues its processes as it always has, but the scale of its influence grows, and with that growth comes consequences that extend beyond its immediate surroundings. The environment begins to shift not only because of physical forces, but because of the cumulative effects of living systems interacting within it. The balance is no longer as steady. It wavers, adjusting more frequently, responding to changes that come faster and with greater intensity. The system still functions, still attempts to regulate itself, but the strain becomes part of its behavior, no longer hidden beneath smooth cycles. This is the moment where stability reveals its true nature. It is not something permanent, not something guaranteed. It exists only as long as the system can maintain it, only as long as the interactions that support it continue to align. When those interactions begin to shift, when their balance changes, stability itself begins to weaken. And yet it does not disappear. The system continues to respond, to adjust, to redistribute even as the pressure builds. It does not return to complete chaos, but it moves closer to it, hovering in a state where balance and disruption exist side by side, each influencing the other. The realization settles quietly but with weight. The balance that formed was never something that could not be lost. It was something that had to be maintained moment by moment, through interactions that could change, that could shift, that could fail under the right conditions. And now, those conditions are beginning to emerge. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a growing tension within the system, a sign that what once seemed stable may only have been temporary, waiting for a moment when the forces within it begin to move in ways that test how much it can endure before something gives way. The tension does not arrive suddenly. It builds in layers, each one subtle on its own, but together forming a weight that begins to press against the system from every direction. What once moved in quiet coordination now begins to drift apart. The connections that held balance together stretching under forces that no longer align as easily as they once did. The atmosphere shifts, but not in ways that return it to familiar patterns. Heat gathers where it once dispersed, and in other places it fades more quickly than expected. The oceans respond, but their responses are uneven, redistributing energy in ways that create new imbalances instead of correcting old ones. The land continues to move, but its movements no longer fit cleanly into the rhythms that once softened their impact. Each system continues to act, but they no longer support one another in the same way. Instead of balancing, they begin to conflict. What cools in one place intensifies in another. What stabilizes briefly is undone by something else, pushing in the opposite direction. The loops that once returned conditions toward equilibrium now struggle to close, leaving changes partially unresolved, carrying their effects forward instead of settling them. The system does not collapse, but it begins to feel unstable in a way that cannot be ignored. This is the edge, that though it does not announce itself, there is no clear line, no moment where everything shifts at once. Instead, there is a growing sense that the interactions holding the system together are no longer enough to contain the changes moving through it. The balance that once seemed to emerge naturally now feels strained, as though it is being held together by processes that are no longer certain of how to respond. Life continues within this tension. It does not pause or retreat. It persists, repeating its processes, interacting with the environment, even as that environment becomes less predictable. And in doing so, it adds to the shifting conditions not intentionally, but inevitably as part of the same system that is now under pressure. The question begins to form quietly but persistently. What happens if this continues? If the interactions remain out of alignment, if the adjustments fail to keep pace with the changes, then the system may reach a point where it can no longer maintain balance at all. The loops may break, the connections may fail, the forces that once cooperated may push fully against one another, driving the planet back toward the kind of instability that defined its earlier state. It is not a distant possibility, it is close enough to feel. The system moves nearer to a threshold, though it cannot be seen directly. Each change brings it closer, each imbalance adds to the strain. And for a moment it seems as though everything that has been built, every interaction that has allowed stability to form, may unravel. And yet it does not. The collapse does not come. The tension rises, the imbalance spreads. The system reaches toward a point where it could fail, and then something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to prevent the final break. The processes continue, the interactions persist. The system does not return to what it was, but it does not fall apart either. It holds. This is where the uncertainty deepens. Because the survival is not explained, there is no clear reason why the system did not cross the threshold. No obvious mechanism that intervened to restore balance. The same forces remain, the same pressures continue, and yet somehow the interactions are just enough to keep the system intact. The planet endures, not because it avoids disruption, but because it moves through it. The balance that once seemed fragile proves to be something else. Not fixed, not secure, but capable of bending without breaking, of shifting without collapsing entirely. And still, the reason for this endurance remains unclear, hidden within the complexity of the system itself. Which leaves behind a question that does not fade easily. When everything came so close to falling apart, when the system reached the edge of what it could withstand, what allowed it to hold together just long enough to survive, the tension does not vanish, but it begins to soften. What once felt like a system on the verge of collapse slowly shifts into something quieter, more controlled, though not in a way that can be easily seen. The same forces remain, the same processes continue, but their interactions begin to change once again, not returning to what they were, but moving towards something new. The atmosphere adjusts, redistributing heat in ways that reduce the extremes that had begun to build. The oceans respond, not immediately but gradually, absorbing and releasing energy in patterns that begin to settle into more consistent cycles. The land continues to move, but its shifts become part of a larger rhythm, no longer pushing the system further out of balance, but contributing to its slow return. Nothing about this recovery is sudden. There is no moment where the system resets, no clear point where instability ends and balance begins again. Instead, the changes unfold over time, almost too slowly to notice in isolation. Each adjustment is small, each response subtle, but together they begin to reshape the behavior of the system. The loops that once struggled to close begin to reconnect. Processes that had drifted apart start to align again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to restore a sense of interaction that had been lost. Heat once again moves through the system, instead of building in isolated pockets. Pressure releases in ways that prevent it from accumulating too far. The environment begins to respond to itself with greater consistency, as though the connections that had weakened are quietly reforming. And yet, the system is not the same. It does not return to its previous state because the changes it has experienced cannot be undone. The disruptions remain part of its history, shaping how it behaves moving forward. The balance that begins to emerge is not a restoration of what was lost, but the formation of something new, built from the adjustments that followed instability. This is where the realization begins to shift, because it becomes clear that the system did not survive by resisting disruption. It survived by adapting to it. The instability that once threatened to break the system becomes part of how it evolves. Each disruption forces adjustments, and those adjustments create new patterns, new interactions, new ways of maintaining balance. Without those disruptions, the system would not change, would not would not develop the capacity to respond in new ways. Chaos is not removed, it is integrated. The forces that once pushed the system toward collapse are the same forces that now contribute to its resilience. They continue to act, continue to shift conditions, but through their interaction with the rest of the system, they become part of the process that maintains balance rather than destroys it. This is the paradox that settles quietly into place. Stability does not come from avoiding instability. It comes from moving through it, from allowing the system to adjust, to respond, to reshape itself in ways that would not be possible without change. The balance that now exists is not fixed. It is active, dynamic, constantly shifting in response to the same forces that once threatened it. It holds, not because it cannot be broken, but because it continues to adapt moment by moment to the conditions that surround it. And in that constant movement, something deeper becomes clear. The Earth is not a stable object. It is a stable process. A system that endures not by remaining the same, but by continuing to change, to adjust, to evolve in ways that allow it to persist even when pushed to its limits. Which leads to a quieter question, one that lingers beyond the recovery itself. If this system depends on its ability to adapt through disruption, then what happens when the disruptions themselves begin to change in ways the system has never encountered before? The calm returns, but it is not the kind that settles everything into stillness. It is quieter, more subtle, almost convincing in the way it hides what continues beneath it. The systems appear steady again. The atmosphere shifts within familiar limits. The oceans move in patterns that feel predictable. And the land continues its slow transformations without drawing attention to itself. From the surface, it feels as though balance has been restored. But beneath that appearance, nothing has stopped. The forces that shape the planet remain active, continuing their work without pause. Heat still rises from within. Pressure still builds and releases. External influences still reach across space and touch the system in ways that cannot be prevented. These forces do not rest simply because the system appears stable. They continue, constant and unbroken, applying pressure that never fully disappears. At first, this pressure feels manageable. The system responds as it has learned to do, adjusting to each shift, redistributing energy, softening extremes before they grow too large. The interactions remain connected, the feedback continues to operate, and the balance holds, not perfectly, but consistently enough to maintain its form. And yet something continues to build. The changes are small, often too subtle to notice in the moment. A slight difference in temperature that lingers longer than before. A shift in the atmosphere that alters how heat moves, even if only slightly. A gradual accumulation of elements in the oceans that changes how they respond over time. Each of these changes seems insignificant on its own, easily absorbed by the system that has already proven it can adapt, but they do not disappear. They remain, layering over one another, creating conditions that slowly begin to differ from what the system has previously adjusted to. The balance does not break, but it begins to shift, not because something has failed, but because the pressures acting upon it are never entirely the same. This is where the understanding begins to deepen. Stability is not something the system reaches and then holds. It is something the system maintains moment by moment, adjusting constantly to forces that never stop acting. There is no final state where balance becomes permanent. No point where the system can remain unchanged. Every moment carries new conditions, new pressures, new interactions that require response. The system is always moving toward balance, but it never arrives, because the moment it adjusts to one set of conditions, those conditions begin to change again. The balance that exists is always temporary, always shifting, always dependent on interactions that are themselves in motion. And this is what gives the calm its quiet tension. Not because collapse is immediate, but because stability is never guaranteed. It exists only as long as the system can continue to respond, only as long as the pressures acting upon it remain within a range that can be managed. The idea settles slowly, almost gently. The Earth does not hold its balance, it chases it. Not with intention, not with awareness, but through the continuous interaction of forces that push and pull in ways that never fully settle. The system does not aim to remain the same, because remaining the same is not possible. It shifts, it adapts, it moves forward, carrying its balance with it as something that must be maintained rather than preserved. And beneath that ongoing adjustment, the pressure continues to build, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, as each new change adds to the system, creating conditions that move it closer to something else, something that has not yet fully emerged. Which raises a quieter question, one that begins to take shape as the system continues its endless adjustment. What happens when the pressure grows beyond what these interactions can manage? When the changes become too large, too fast, or too different for the system to absorb as it has before? The pressure does not remain distant. It builds quietly, steadily, until the system begins to feel it in ways that can no longer be absorbed as easily as before. What once adjusted smoothly now hesitates. The responses that once kept everything within balance begin to lag, arriving just a little too late, or not with enough strength to fully counter what is changing. At first, the differences are subtle. The atmosphere holds on to heat longer than it should, releasing it unevenly. The oceans respond, but their movements carry that imbalance further, spreading it instead of dissolving it. The land continues to shift, but its changes now amplify what is already unstable, adding pressure where there is already too much. The loops are still there, they continue to operate, still connecting the systems, still attempting to regulate what is happening. But their ability to compensate begins to weaken. Each response corrects only part of the change, leaving something behind that continues forward, adding to the next shift, and then the next. The system does not collapse, but it begins to strain in a way that feels different from before. The adjustments become more frequent, more intense, as though the planet is trying to keep up with changes that are no longer moving at a pace it can easily follow. What once unfolded gradually now begins to accelerate. Small shifts grow faster, their effects spreading more quickly through the interconnected system. And within this acceleration, something begins to feel inevitable. Not because collapse is certain, but because the limits of the system begin to reveal themselves. The balance that has been maintained through constant adjustment is not without boundaries. There is a range within which it can operate, a space where interactions can continue to compensate for one another, and that space is beginning to narrow. Each new change pushes the system closer to those limits, testing how much it can absorb, how far it can stretch before its responses are no longer enough. The interactions continue, but they no longer fully contain what is happening. The balance wavers, not disappearing, but become unstable, less predictable, more spree. This is where the moment begins to take shape, not as a single event, not as a sudden break, but as a gradual approach toward a point where the system can no longer behave as it has before. The patterns that once repeated begin to shift. The cycles that once returned to familiar states begin to move towards something else. And then, something changes. Not everything at once, not in a way that feels like collapse, but in a way that alters how the system operates. The balance does not hold in its current form. It cannot. The pressures have moved beyond what it can maintain through adjustment alone. But it does not fall apart, instead it transforms. The interactions that once defined the system begin to reorganize. New patterns emerge, not as a correction of what has been lost, but as a response to what has changed. The loops that struggled to compensate begin to function differently, creating new relationships between the same forces. The system does not return to its previous state. It becomes something else. The balance that forms is not the one that existed before the strain. It is shaped by the changes that pushed the system to its limits, by the adjustments that followed, by the interactions that could no longer remain the same. This is where the realization begins to settle. Breaking the system is not the end of balance. It is part of how balance evolves. What appears as a failure is also a transition, a movement from one state to another, guided not by intention, but by the necessity of adapting to conditions that could not be maintained in the same way. The system survives, but it does so by becoming different. And in that difference, something new begins to take hold, something that carries the history of what came before while also moving beyond it, which leaves behind a quieter, more reflective question. If each breaking point leads to transformation, if each limit gives rise to a new form of balance, then what kind of system is being created over time, and how do these changes shape what the planet will become next? What emerges after each strain is not a return, but a continuation. The system moves forward, carrying with it the traces of every disruption, every adjustment, every moment where it was forced to change. Nothing is erased, nothing is undone. Each shift becomes part of what the system is now, shaping how it responds to what comes next. At first, it still appears stable. The atmosphere settles into patterns that feel consistent. The oceans move with rhythms that seem familiar. The land continues its slow transformations, no longer signaling instability, but something quieter, something that suggests endurance. To observe it in a single moment is to see balance. But over time, that balance reveals something different. It is not the same balance that existed before. The conditions have changed. The interactions have shifted. The system that now holds itself together does so through patterns that did not exist in the past. What feels steady is not fixed, but formed from countless changes that have reshaped how everything connects. This is where the understanding begins to deepen, because it becomes clear that stability is not something the planet preserves. It is something the planet creates again and again. Each disruption introduces new conditions. Each adjustment reshapes how the system responds. Each transformation alters the relationships between forces that continue to act without awareness. And through all of this, the system does not seek to return to what it was. It continues forward. The balance that exists at any moment is temporary, not because it is weak, but because it is part of an ongoing process. It holds only as long as the conditions that support it remain within a range that can be maintained. When those conditions shift, the balance shifts with them, not resisting the change, but adapting to it. This is why the system endures. Not because it avoids change, but because it depends on it. The forces that shape the planet do not stop. do not settle, do not reach a final state. They continue to interact, to influence one another, to create new conditions that require new responses. And the system adjusts, not perfectly, not without strain, but consistently enough to persist. The idea settles slowly, almost quietly. The Earth is not stable in the way it appears. It is stable in the way it behaves. It does not remain the same. It does not hold a single state across time. Instead, it maintains continuity through change, carrying its balance forward as something that evolves rather than something that is preserved. This changes how everything is understood. The calm that exists is not the absence of movement. It is the result of countless movements interacting in ways that prevent collapse. The stability that is seen is not permanent. It is the current expression of a system that has been shaped by everything that came before it. And it will continue to change because the forces that drive it do not stop. The interactions that define it do not end. The balance that holds it together is not a destination, but a process that unfolds continuously. And in that realization, something quieter begins to take form. A sense that the planet is not something that has become stable, but something that remains stable by never becoming still, by continuing to adapt, to shift, to move through every change that it encounters, which leaves one final thought lingering at the edge of understanding. If the Earth's balance is something that keeps changing, something that is always becoming rather than being, then what we experience now is not a final state, but just one moment in a process that has no true beginning and no true end. And from that moment, the story continues, moving forward into the world that feels familiar, yet is shaped by forces that have never stopped changing. The story does not stay in the distant past. It moves forward quietly, without announcing the transition, carrying everything that has unfolded into the present moment. The same planet turns beneath the same sky. Yet now it feels familiar, calm, almost unchanging, as though the long history of instability is settled into something steady and reliable. But that calm is only what appears on the surface. Beneath it, the same system continues. The air that moves gently across the skin is not still. It shifts, carries heat, redistributes energy across the planet in ways that are never fully at rest. The oceans that stretch beyond the horizon do not simply exist as vast, silent bodies of water. They move constantly, absorbing warmth, releasing it, shaping climates that extend far beyond their boundaries. The land beneath remains active as well, shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet never completely still. Everything continues to interact. The atmosphere responds to the oceans respond to the land responds to forces rising from deep within. These interactions do not pause, do not settle into a final arrangement. They continue, moment by moment, adjusting to changes that are often too small to notice, yet constant enough to shape the world as it is experienced. And still, it feels stable. Days pass, seasons change, patterns repeat in ways that create the sense of predictability. The sky clears and clouds return. Temperatures rise and fall within expected limits. The world behaves in ways that feel consistent, giving the impression that it has reached a state of balance that no longer needs to change. But that impression is incomplete, because nothing has stopped. The same processes that once shaped a chaotic planet are still active, still adjusting, still responding to every shake that occurs. The difference is not in their absence, but in how they now interact. The extremes are softened, the changes distributed, the interactions aligned just enough to create the experience of stability. It is not that the system has become still. It is that it has become continuous. Every moment carries adjustment. Heat moves, air shifts, water flows, and within these movements balance is maintained. Not as something fixed, but as something that is constantly being created. The system does not hold its stability in place. It produces it again and again, through interactions that never fully settle. This is where the realization begins to take hold. The world that feels stable is not resting. It is working, quietly, continuously, without pause. The system beneath everything is adjusting itself, responding to conditions that are always changing, even when those changes are too small to notice. The calm that is experienced is not the absence of movement, but the result of movements that are balanced in ways that prevent disruption from becoming visible. And yet that balance is not guaranteed. It exists only as long as the interactions continue to function within certain limits, only as long as the adjustments remain effective. The system does not promise stability. It creates it, moment by moment, through processes that never stop. This changes how the present is understood. Because the world is not something that has become stable over time. It is something that is being stabilized constantly, through interactions that remain active beneath every moment of calm. The air, the water, the land, and the life that exists within them are all part of this process, each contributing in ways that are not immediately visible, yet essential to maintaining the balance that is experienced. And in that quiet realization, something begins to shift. The familiar world no longer feels as simple as it once did. It becomes something more dynamic, more interconnected, more active beneath its surface than it appears. Which leads to a deeper question, one that emerges naturally as the system becomes more visible. If this balance is maintained through continuous adjustment, and if all parts of the system contribute to that process, then what role does something new, something different, play within it now? For most of its history, the system adjusted only to forces that behaved in familiar ways. Heat rose and dispersed, pressure built and released, oceans absorbed and returned energy. Life itself interacted within these patterns, influencing them, but always remaining part of a process that responded over time, gradually, continuously. And then something different appeared. It did not arrive as a single event, nor did it announce itself as a new force within the system. It began quietly, like everything else, emerging from the same processes that had shaped life before it. But what followed did not behave in the same way. This presence did not simply respond. It acted. At first, its influence was small, barely noticeable within the larger movements of the planet. But unlike other processes, it did not unfold slowly. Its changes were not spread across vast stretches of time. They were immediate, direct, and often concentrated in ways that had not existed before. The land began to change more quickly in certain places, reshaped not by internal forces, but by actions that altered its surface in moments. The atmosphere shifted, not only through natural cycles, but through additions that accumulated faster than the system was accustomed to balancing. The oceans, too, began to respond to changes that did not originate from their usual interactions, carrying new conditions across their depths. These changes did not follow the same patterns. They did not emerge gradually, nor did they always return to earlier states. They moved in directions that were not always aligned with the existing system, pushing conditions beyond what had previously been maintained. And yet, this new force was not separate from the system. It existed within it, shaped by it, dependent on it, just as life had always been. But its behavior was different. It was different. It did not simply adapt to conditions. It altered them with speed and intent, creating changes that did not always allow for the slow adjustments the system relied upon. This is where the contrast begins to take shape. The forces that once defined the planet operated without awareness, without direction, responding to conditions in ways that naturally led back toward balance over time. Even life, in its earliest forms, influenced the system through processes that repeated and adjusted gradually. But this new presence does not always return in the same way. Its actions are not bound by the same rhythms. They can intensify, rapidly shift direction suddenly, and introduce changes that the system has not encountered before. The feedback that once maintained balance still exists, still responds. But now it encounters something that does not always move in cycles, something that can continue in one direction without naturally correcting itself. The system begins to adjust, as it always has. The atmosphere responds, the oceans redistribute, the land shifts, all attempting to absorb and balance what is being introduced. But the pace of these adjustments feels different, as though the responses are being tested in ways that were not part of the system's earlier history. There is no immediate collapse. The balance still holds. The interactions continue. The system remains active and responsive, but beneath that continuity, something new is present, something that does not fully align with the patterns that once defined how the system behaved. And this creates a quiet tension. Not through sudden disruption, but through the awareness that the system is now interacting with something it did not evolve alongside. a force that exists within it, yet behaves in ways that are not entirely consistent with the processes that have maintained balance over time. The idea settles slowly. The Earth has always adapted to change, always responded to new conditions, always adjusted to forces acting within and upon it. But this is different not because it cannot respond, but because the nature of what it is responding to has changed, and the question that follows does not demand an immediate answer. It simply lingers, shaping the way the system is now seen. If the balance of the planet was formed through processes that adjust over time, through interactions that eventually return toward equilibrium, then what happens when a force emerges that does not follow those same patterns? That moves faster. That changes direction differently. That does not naturally settle in the same way. And as that question begins to take hold, the story moves forward, drawn toward understanding how the system responds when it is pushed beyond the patterns it has always known. The system does not pause to consider what has changed or what has changed. It does not ask where the pressure comes from, or whether it follows familiar patterns. It continues as it always has, responding to conditions as they arise, adjusting through the same interactions that have shaped the planet across its entire history. The atmosphere shifts first. New elements move through it, altering how heat is absorbed and released, changing the way energy travels across the surface. These changes are not immediate in their effects. They unfold, gradually influencing patterns that take time to reveal themselves. Air currents adjust, redistributing warmth in ways that attempt to soften extremes, though not always with the same balance that once existed. The oceans respond next. They absorb what they can, taking in heat, redistributing it through currents that stretch across vast distances. But the responses are not perfectly aligned. Some areas hold more than they release, others release more than they absorb, creating variations that ripple outward. The water continues to move, continues to interact, but its adjustments are not always enough to return conditions to what they were before. The land remains part of this process. It shifts slowly as it always has, but now it carries the effects of what is happening above and below. Changes in temperature influence its surface, while movements beneath continue to reshape it over long periods of time. It does not act independently. It participates in the same system, responding through interactions that connect it to everything else. And within all of this, life continues to act as well. It persists, adapts, responds to new conditions, just as it has done before. But now, its presence adds another layer to the system's adjustments, influencing how elements move, how they accumulate, how they are transformed and returned. The system is not made of separate parts. It is a network of interactions, each one affecting the others, each one contributing to how balance is maintained. The adjustments are constant, but they are not precise. They do not restore the system to a fixed state. They move it toward balance, but never fully arrive. Each response corrects part of what has changed while other aspects continue forward, carrying their effects into the next cycle. The system is always responding, always adjusting, but never completing the process entirely. And this is where the realization begins to deepen. The system does not recognize why change has occurred. It does not distinguish between what comes from some natural forces and what comes from something new. It responds to conditions, not to causes. Heat is heat. Pressure is pressure. Change is change. The origin does not alter the response. The system reacts in the same way, regardless of where the shift began. This creates a quiet sense of inevitability, because it means that the system will continue to adjust no matter what influences it. No matter how those influences behave, it will absorb, redistribute, respond, attempting to maintain balance through the same processes that have always guided it. But those processes have limits. They depend on interactions that take time, on feedback that unfolds gradually, on adjustments that cannot always keep pace with rapid change. The system continues to respond, but the question is no longer whether it will adjust. It is whether those adjustments will be enough. The answer does not appear here. Instead, the system continues its work, shifting, responding, adapting, as it always has, carrying the effects of each change forward into what comes next. And as those changes continue to build, another question begins to take shape, one that cannot be ignored for long. If the system responds to every change without recognizing its source, Then what happens when the nature of those changes moves beyond what its responses can fully contain? For most of its history, the system has adjusted in its own time. Changes unfolded slowly, often over spans so long they could not be perceived in a single moment. Heat rose and fell across ages. The atmosphere shifted through gradual transitions. Oceans moved in cycles that repeated with patience, allowing the system to respond, to redistribute, to settle into new forms of balance without being forced beyond its limits. The pace mattered. It allowed interactions to complete themselves, feedback to return, adjustments to take effect before the next change arrived. The system was not perfect, but it was consistent, shaped by time as much as by force. But now something begins to feel different. The changes do not wait, they arrive closer together, one following another before the previous adjustment has fully settled. The atmosphere shifts, but before it can redistribute what has changed, something else alters its state again. The oceans respond, but their movements now carry overlapping influences, each one adding to the next before balance can be restored. The system continues to function. It still absorbs, still redistributes, still attempts to adjust in the ways it always has. But the timing begins to shift. The responses are no longer aligned with the changes that trigger them. They follow behind, not fully catching up, leaving conditions that remain partially unresolved. This is where the tension begins to take shape, not as a sudden disruption, not as an immediate collapse, but as a difference in rhythm. The system moves at one pace, while the changes move at another. The balance that once formed through continuous interaction now struggles to keep its alignment, not because the processes have stopped working, but because they are being asked to respond faster than they were ever shaped to do. The atmosphere carries changes forward before it has time to settle them. The oceans redistribute energy, but their adjustments overlap, creating patterns that do not fully resolve. The land continues its slow movement, but it cannot match the speed at which conditions above it shift. Everything remains active, everything continues to respond, and yet something remains unfinished within each cycle. The system does not fail, but it begins to lag. This lag is not immediately visible. It does not break the balance all at once. Instead, it creates a quiet accumulation of unresolved changes, each one small on its own, but together forming a growing distance between what is happening and how the system responds to it. The idea settles slowly. The system was shaped by gradual change, by interactions that unfold over time, by adjustments that require space to complete. When that space is reduced, when changes arrive too quickly, the responses begin to overlap, and the balance that once formed naturally becomes more difficult to maintain. And yet, the system does not stop trying. It continues to adjust, continues to respond, continues to operate as it always has. But the question is no longer whether it can respond. It is whether it can respond fast enough. This is where the unease begins to deepen. Because the balance that once felt reliable now carries a subtle uncertainty. Not because it has failed, but because it is being tested in a way that it has not experienced before. The system is still functioning, but it may not be keeping up. And as this realization begins to take hold, the story moves forward, drawn toward understanding what happens when the strain increases, when the pace continues to accelerate, and when the gap between change and response becomes something the system can no longer ignore. The change does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a single event or a clear break from what has been known. Instead, it appears in small ways, quiet shifts that blend into the patterns people are already used to seeing. The sky still moves through its cycles. The oceans still rise and fall. The air still carries warmth and coolness across the surface. Everything appears to continue as it always has. And yet, something begins to feel slightly different. Not enough to draw immediate attention, not enough to be clearly defined, but enough to create a faint sense that the patterns are no longer repeating in quite the same way. Temperatures drift a little beyond their usual limits, then return, but not always to the same place. Seasonal changes still occur, but their timing feels less precise, less anchored to the rhythms that once seemed dependable. The differences are small. They do not disrupt the system in obvious ways. They do not create sudden instability or visible collapse. Instead, they exist at the edges of perception, where change can occur without being fully noticed. This is where the signs begin to gather. The atmosphere behaves in ways that are just slightly less predictable, carrying variations that do not fully resolve. The oceans shift, their movements still steady, yet influenced by conditions that are not entirely familiar. The land remains stable in appearance, but the interactions that shape it continue to evolve beneath the surface. Nothing stands out. Each change can be explained on its own, understood as part of the system's natural variation. The patterns are still there, still repeating, still creating the impression of continuity. And because of that, the changes are easy to accept as normal, as part of the same system that has always adjusted and adapted. This is what makes them difficult to see, not because they are hidden, but because they do not appear significant. They do not demand attention. They do not interrupt the sense of stability that people rely on. Instead, they move quietly within it, altering conditions in ways that feel gradual, almost invisible. The system continues to function. It still responds, still adjusts, still redistributes what changes. But the responses begin to carry slight differences as well. They do not return conditions to exactly what they were before. They settle into states that are just a little altered, just a little shifted, enough to carry those differences forward into the next cycle, and those differences begin to accumulate. Not dramatically, not in a way that forces recognition, but steadily, building over time as each small shift adds to the next. The system does not break, but it begins to move in ways that are no longer perfectly aligned with its previous patterns. This creates a quiet separation between what is seen and what is happening. On the surface, the world still feels stable. The patterns still repeat. The cycles still give the impression of consistency. But beneath that appearance, the interactions are changing, the balance is shifting, and the system is moving towards something that has not yet fully emerged. The mind tends to look for clear signals. It expects change to be visible, to arrive in ways that are easy to recognize. But here, the signals do not follow that expectation. They exist in the details, in the slight variations, in the patterns that feel familiar but are no longer exactly the same. And because they are not dramatic, they are easy to overlook. This is where the realization begins to settle slowly, almost quietly. The largest changes do not always begin with obvious signs. They begin with small differences that carry forward, shaping the system in ways that are difficult to detect until enough time has passed for their effects to become unavoidable. And by then, the system has already begun to shift, which leads to a deeper question, one that emerges as these subtle changes continue to build. If the signs are present but easily missed, if the system is already moving in ways that are not fully recognized, then how close might it be to a point where those small differences gather into something larger, something that can no longer remain hidden within the patterns that once felt stable? The changes continue to gather, each one small enough to feel manageable, each one absorbed into the system as part of its constant adjustment. Nothing breaks, nothing stops. The balance still appears to hold, shaped by the same interactions that have carried it this far. But beneath that continuity, something begins to approach. Not an event, not a single moment that can be clearly identified, but a condition, a point where the accumulation of change begins to alter how the system behaves. The pressure does not arrive suddenly. It builds quietly, layer by layer, each small shift adding to what came before, creating a state that is no longer the same as it once was. The system continues to respond. It absorbs, redistributes, adjusts, just as it always has. Each change is met with another, each imbalance softened by interaction. But the responses do not remove what has accumulated, they only shape how it continues forward. And this is where the threshold begins to take form. It is not visible. There is no clear line that marks its presence, no signal that announces its arrival. The system does not display it, does not warn when it is near. It exists within the conditions themselves, defined not by a single change, but by the total weight of all changes combined. For a long time, nothing appears to happen. The balance continues. The patterns repeat. The adjustments remain active. The system behaves as though it is still within the range. It is always in the range it has always known, still capable of responding in the same ways. But the conditions are no longer the same. They have shifted, slowly, quietly, moving toward a point where the interactions that once maintained balance may no longer be enough to hold it in place. The system does not recognize this point as it approaches. It does not prepare for it. It continues to operate as it always has, until something changes, not gradually, but all at once. The shift does not unfold in the same slow way as the changes that led to it. It emerges suddenly, as though the system has crossed a boundary that was never visible, moving from one state into another, without passing through anything in between. The patterns that once held begin to reorganize. The responses that once stabilized now produce different outcomes. The interactions that once aligned now move in new directions, not because the system has chosen to change, but because the conditions that defined its previous behavior no longer exist. And yet there is no warning. No signal marks the moment before it happens. No clear sign reveals when the system is about to shift. The balance does not fade gradually into something else. It holds, and then it changes. This is what makes the threshold difficult to understand. It cannot be seen until it has already been crossed. It does not reveal itself through the small changes that lead toward it. It remains hidden within them, part of the process that builds towards something that only becomes visible once it has already begun. The realization settles quietly but with weight. The system does not promise to remain within the balance it has formed. It does not guarantee that its adjustments will always be enough. It continues to respond, but it does so without awareness of where those responses might lead. And somewhere within those responses, thresholds exist, unseen, unmarked, waiting within the accumulation of change, which leads to a question that does not easily settle. If the system can shift without warning, if the balance can change suddenly after long periods of quiet adjustment, then how close might it already be to a threshold that has not yet revealed itself? After the shift, there is no silence. The system does not pause to recover, does not hold itself still as though waiting for stability to return. Instead, it continues, moving through the change without interruption, carrying forward the same processes that have always defined it. The atmosphere still shifts, the oceans still move, the land continues its slow transformation, and life persists within it all. Nothing has stopped, and yet nothing is exactly the same. The balance that once existed does not return in its previous form. The conditions that shaped it have changed, and with them, the interactions that maintained it have shifted as well. The system does not attempt to restore what was lost. It cannot. The past does not exist in a way that can be returned to. Instead, something new begins to form. At first, it is subtle, almost indistinguishable from the continuation of what came before. The patterns begin to settle again, though they follow slightly different paths. The cycles reappear, though their timing and intensity are not quite the same. The system adjusts, not by reversing what has changed, but by responding to it as part of its new reality. This is where the understanding begins to deepen. Balance does not disappear when disruption occurs. It transforms. The forces that once created stability continue to act, but they now operate within altered conditions. The atmosphere redistributes heat in new ways. The oceans carry energy along different paths. The land responds to pressures that have shifted beneath it. Each process continues, but none of them return to their previous state. The system moves forward. It carries its history within it, shaped by every disruption, every adjustment, every transformation that has occurred. But it does not attempt to become what it once was. It becomes something else, something shaped by the conditions that now exist. This is what gives the system its resilience, not the ability to return, but the ability to continue. Each change, no matter how significant, becomes part of what the system is now. The balance that forms is not a restoration, but a new arrangement of interactions, a new way for the system to maintain itself within its current conditions. And this continues without end. The processes do not slow. The interactions do not settle into stillness. The system remains active, adjusting moment by moment, responding to every shift that occurs. Stability is not something that is regained and then held. It is something that is created continuously, shaped by the conditions of the present rather than the memory of the past. The idea settles quietly. The earth does not try to go back. It does not seek to recover what has been lost or restore what once existed. It moves forward, carrying its balance with it as something that evolves, something that changes as the system itself changes. This changes how disruption is understood. It is not an interruption of balance, but part of how balance forms. Each shift creates new conditions, and those conditions shape the interactions that follow. The system does not resist this process. It depends on it, and in that dependence something steady begins to emerge. Not a fixed state, not a final balance, but a continuity that persists through change, allowing the system to endure even as it transforms, which leads to a quieter reflection. If the system never returns to what it once was, if it only moves forward into new forms of balance, then the world that exists now is not the result of a single stable state, but the outcome of countless transformations, each one shaping what is experienced in the present. And from that realization, the story begins to turn towards something closer, something more familiar, something that exists within the balance, that continues to unfold. The world as it is experienced feels steady. Days follow nights with quiet reliability. Seasons arrive and depart in patterns that seem familiar, almost dependable. The air moves gently, the oceans rise and fall. The land beneath remains firm, offering a sense of permanence that rarely invites question. Everything appears to repeat in ways that create comfort, as though the system has settled into a state that no longer needs to change. This feeling is powerful. It shapes how the world is understood, how it is remembered, how it is trusted. Stability becomes something assumed, something that seems built into the planet itself, as though it exists independently of the processes that create it. And yet beneath that experience something else is happening. The same movements continue, the same interactions unfold, never stopping, never settling into stillness. The atmosphere shifts constantly, even when the sky appears calm. The oceans move in patterns that extend far beyond what can be seen from the surface. The land changes slowly, almost invisibly, carrying forces that remain active beneath every moment of stillness. Nothing is truly at rest. The patterns that feel stable are not fixed. They are repeated, adjusted, and maintained through continuous interaction. What appears consistent is the result of countless small changes aligning in ways that create the impression of permanence. This is where the contrast begins to emerge. The world feels stable because its changes are often too slow to notice, too gradual to disrupt the sense of continuity. The system does not stop moving, but it moves in ways that blend into experience, making its constant adjustment feel like something unchanging. The illusion is not false, it is simply incomplete, because the stability that is felt is real, but it does not exist as a fixed state. It exists as an experience shaped by patterns that hold together long enough to be recognized, long enough to feel dependable, even though they continue to shift beneath that recognition. The mind looks for permanence. It expects stability to mean something that does not change, something that can be relied upon to remain the same. But the system does not offer that kind of stability. It offers continuity, a flow of interactions that maintain balance over time, even as the conditions within that balance evolve. This is why the world feels consistent, not because it has stopped changing, but because its changes are organized in ways that create familiarity. The cycles repeat, the patterns return, and within that repetition, the sense of stability forms, even though the details within those patterns are never exactly the same. And this realization begins to shift perspective. The ground beneath is not fixed in the way it seems. The air above is not still in the way it feels. The oceans are not steady in the way they appear. Everything continues to move, to adjust, to respond, even when that movement cannot be directly observed. The stability that is experienced is something created by perception. It is how the system feels from within, not how it exists in its entirety. And this does not diminish it, it deepens it. Because it reveals that the world is more dynamic than it appears, more active beneath its surface than it suggests, the calm that is felt is not the absence of change, but the result of changes that remain balanced enough to avoid disruption. The idea settles quietly. Stability is not something that exists as a fixed condition. It is something that is experienced, shaped by patterns that hold together long enough to be understood, even as they continue to evolve. And within that understanding, something shifts. The familiar world begins to feel different, not less stable, but more alive with movement, more connected to processes that continue beyond what can be easily seen, which leads to a deeper reflection. If stability is something that is felt rather than something that is fixed, Then what place does perception hold within this system? And how does that perception shape the way humans understand their role within a balance that is constantly unfolding? The world feels separate at first. The air is something that surrounds, the oceans something distant, the land something beneath, and life something that exists upon it all. It is easy to imagine that these parts belong to different layers, each one existing on its own, connected only by proximity rather than by process, but that separation does not hold for long. The same system that moves through air, water, and land also moves through every living thing within it. Each breath carries the atmosphere inward. Each step presses against the surface. Each action introduces change that does not remain isolated. Nothing exists outside the system. Everything participates within it, whether that participation is noticed or not. This includes what is often thought of as separate. Human presence feels distinct, defined by awareness, intention, and the ability to act in ways that appear independent from the natural processes that shape the planet. And yet, even within that difference, the connection remains. Every action becomes part of the system. Changes to the land alter how it responds to heat and movement. Changes to the atmosphere shift how energy flows across the surface. Changes within the oceans influence patterns that extend far beyond their origin. None of these changes remain isolated. They move outward, carried through the same interactions that have always maintained balance. There is no boundary where participation ends. The system does not recognize separation. It does not distinguish between what is part of it and what is outside of it. Everything that occurs within its reach becomes part of its ongoing process, influencing and being influenced in return. This is where the realization begins to settle. Humanity is not something that exists apart from the balance of the planet. It exists within it. The same interactions that shape the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land also shape every living process. The same system that adjusts to changes in heat and pressure also adjusts to changes introduced by human activity. There is no separate layer, no external position from which the system can be observed without being part of it. And yet this understanding does not arrive as something forceful. It does not demand responsibility or impose judgment. It simply reveals connection. Every movement, every change, every action becomes part of the same network of interactions that has always defined the planet. Nothing stands outside of it. Nothing acts without becoming part of what follows. This changes how presence is understood. It is no longer something separate from the system, but something that exists within its flow, shaped by it and shaping it in return. The distinction between observer and participant begins to fade, replaced by the understanding that to exist within this system is to influence it, whether intentionally or not. And this influence does not stand alone. It joins everything else. The forces that rise from within the planet, the movements of the atmosphere, the cycles of the oceans, the persistence of life, all of them continue to interact. And within those interactions, human presence becomes another part of the balance, not separate from it. The idea settles quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perspective. The balance that shapes the planet is not something distant, not something that exists beyond reach. It is something that includes everything within it, something that continues through every interaction, every change, every moment. And within that understanding, the story begins to move forward. Because if humanity has always been part of this balance, if every action becomes part of the system that continues to adjust and respond, then what lies ahead is not separate from what has come before, but a continuation of the same process. A process that has never stopped, and one that is still unfolding, carrying everything within it into whatever comes next. The story does not move forward in a sudden leap. There is no clear moment where the present ends and the future begins. No line divides what is happening now from what will happen next. Instead, everything continues, flowing from one moment into another so smoothly that the transition is almost impossible to notice. The future is already here, not as something fully formed, not as something waiting to arrive, but as something unfolding quietly within the present. Every process that's been described, every interaction that shapes the balance of the planet, continues without pause, extending itself into what comes next. The atmosphere still shifts, It carries heat, redistributes energy, adjusts to changes that are never fully complete. The oceans continue to move, absorbing, releasing, influencing patterns that stretch across the surface. The land remains active, shaped by forces that rise from within, slowly altering what appears unchanging. Nothing waits. Nothing holds still in anticipation of what is to come. The system does not pause between moments, preparing for the future as though it was separate from the present. It moves continuously, each adjustment becoming part of what follows, each change carried forward into the next state. This is where the understanding begins to shift. The future is not an event, it is a continuation. What will happen is already being shaped by what is happening now. The balance that exists in this moment does not remain contained within it. It extends outward, influencing what the system will become as it continues to adjust and respond. The idea of a distant future begins to dissolve. There is no separate place where it exists, no point ahead where everything changes at once. Instead, it emerges gradually, built from the same interactions that have always defined the system. Each movement, each response, each adjustment contributes to what comes next, forming a path that is not predetermined but continuously shaped. And this path is already unfolding. The changes that are visible today are not isolated. They are part of a sequence connected to what has come before and what will follow. The system does not jump from one state to another without transition. It moves through a continuous process where each moment carries the influence of the last. This creates a different sense of time, not as a series of separate stages, but as a flow that cannot be divided cleanly. The present is not a fixed point, it is part of a movement, something that exists only as it passes into what comes next. The future, then, is not something waiting ahead, it is something that is already forming, already taking shape within the conditions that exist now. And yet it remains uncertain, not because it is distant, but because it is still in motion. The interactions that define it are still unfolding, still adjusting, still responding to influences that continue to change. There is no final form waiting to be revealed, only a process that continues to evolve. This is what gives the future its quiet complexity. It is not separate from the present, but it is not fully contained within it either. It exists in the movement between moments, shaped by forces that do not stop, guided by interactions that do not settle. The realization settles slowly. The future is not something that will arrive. It is something that is already happening. And within that understanding, the story begins to take on a different perspective. Because if the future is already in motion, if it is being shaped continuously by the same system that has always maintained balance, then what lies ahead is not an unknown event waiting to unfold, but a continuation of a process that has never stopped. A process that will keep moving, carrying the planet forward into whatever it becomes next. Change does not wait. It does not pause for recognition, does not slow itself to match expectation, and does not adjust its pace to fit within the boundaries of awareness. It moves as it always has, shaped by conditions, guided by interactions that continue without interruption. The system does not ask whether it should change. It simply does. The atmosphere shifts when its composition alters, carrying the effects forward without hesitation. The oceans respond to heat and movement, redistributing what they receive, not because they choose to, but because that is how they function. The land continues its slow transformation, shaped by forces that do not consult intention or consider consequence. Everything follows its path, not a predetermined path, but one formed through interaction where each change leads to another, where each response becomes part of what comes next. The system does not stop to evaluate these movements. It does not measure them against a desired outcome. It continues because continuation is what defines it. This is where the contrast begins to emerge. There is a natural inclination to see change as something that can be guided, something that can be directed or controlled. The idea forms that if conditions can be influenced, then outcomes can be shaped, that the system itself might respond in ways that align with intention. But the system does not operate in that way. It does not recognize intention. It does not respond to desire or expectation. It responds to conditions, to forces that act within it, to interactions that follow from those forces. The origin of change does not alter how it behaves. Whether the shift begins deep within the planet in the movement of oceans or through actions that arise from life itself, the response remains the same. The system adjusts. It redistributes, it balances, it transforms, but it does so without direction from any single source. There is no central point from which it can be guided, no place where control can be applied to shape the entirety of its behavior. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It settles gradually, as the patterns become clearer, as the continuity of change reveals itself. Every transformation that has occurred from the earliest instability to the balance that exists now has followed this same principle. Change does not ask permission. It unfolds. It continues through every interaction, every adjustment, every shift that moves the system forward. It does not wait for awareness. It does not depend on understanding. It exists as part of the process that defines the planet itself. And within that process, influence exists. Actions can alter conditions. They can introduce new elements, shift existing patterns, create changes that ripple through the system. But influence is not the same as control. It does not determine the outcome. It becomes part of the interactions that shape what follows. The system remains larger. It absorbs, responds, adjusts, integrating each influence into a network that continues to move beyond any single input. The result is not directed by one force, but formed through the combination of all forces acting together. This is what gives change its inevitability, not because it is unstoppable in a dramatic sense, but because it is continuous. It does not begin or end at a single moment. It flows through the system, carried by interactions that do not pause, shaped by conditions that are always evolving. The idea settles quietly. Control has never been part of this system. Participation has everything that exists within it contributes to what it becomes, but nothing stands above it, directing its path. The balance that forms is not commanded, it emerges. And in that emergence, something deeper begins to take shape. A shift in how presence is understood, not as something separate that can guide the system from the outside, but as something within it, moving alongside every change that continues to unfold, which leads to a quieter realization, one that begins to form as the system continues its steady movement. If change does not ask permission, if it continues regardless of awareness or intention, then what does it mean to exist within a system that moves forward, whether it is noticed or not? The movement never stops, and yet it does not feel chaotic. There is a rhythm within it, a continuity that carries each change into the next without disruption. The atmosphere shifts, the oceans move, the land transforms, and through all of it, there is a sense of flow that does not break, even as everything continues to evolve. This is where the calm begins to emerge. Not from stillness, not from the absence of movement, but from the way movement connects. Each change does not stand alone. It follows from what came before and leads into what comes next, creating a sequence that feels unbroken, even as the details within it continue to shift. The system does not pause. It does not settle into a final state or arrive at a point where change is no longer needed. It continues, moment by moment, adjusting, responding, carrying itself forward through interactions that remain active beneath every sense of stability. And yet, this continuity creates something unexpected. It creates calm, because the changes are not random. They are not disconnected or abrupt in a way that disrupts the entire system at once. They are part of a process that has always existed, a process that maintains itself through movement rather than through stillness. The idea begins to take shape slowly. Stability is not the absence of change. It is the presence of continuity. The system does not remain stable by holding itself in place. It remains stable by continuing to move in ways that prevent collapse, by allowing each change to be met with another, by carrying balance forward through interaction rather than preservation. This is why the world can feel calm, even as everything within it continues to shift. The air moves, but it does not overwhelm. The oceans flow, but they do not break apart. The land changes, but it does not lose its form. Each process continues, and within that continuation, the system maintains a sense of balance that can be felt even if it is not fixed. This changes how stability is understood. It is no longer something that must be held or protected as a final state. It is something that exists within movement, something that emerges from the way changes connect, rather than from the absence of change itself. The realization does not arrive with urgency. It settles gently. There is no final point where the system becomes complete, no moment where everything reaches a perfect and unchanging balance. That state does not exist. It never has. The system has always moved, always adjusted, always carried itself forward through interactions that never fully settle. And yet it endures, not because it stops changing, but because it continues. The calm that is felt is not the result of stillness. It is the result of a process that does not break, a continuity that allows the system to move through change without losing its balance entirely. This creates a different kind of understanding, one that does not look for a final state or a perfect outcome, but instead recognizes the ongoing nature of the system, the way it persists through every shift, every adjustment, every transformation that becomes part of its movement. And within that understanding, something softens. The need for a fixed point begins to fade, replaced by an awareness that stability exists within the process itself, not outside of it. The idea settles quietly. True stability is not stillness. It is the ability to keep changing. And as this realization takes hold, the story begins to move toward its final reflection, carrying this sense of calm forward into a deeper understanding of what it means to exist within a system that has never stopped moving. Nothing new appears. The same atmosphere moves above. The same oceans stretch across the surface. The same land holds its shape, and the same processes continue without pause. The system has not changed in its nature. It still shifts, still adjusts, still carries itself forward through interactions that never settle into stillness. And yet it feels different now. Not because the system has transformed in this moment, but because the way it is seen has shifted. What once appeared chaotic, unpredictable, even unstable, now reveals a kind of continuity that was always there. The movements that once seemed disconnected begin to align, forming patterns that were hidden beneath the surface of perception. The story has not altered the system. It has altered the perspective. The early instability, the constant change, the moments of disruption, all remain part of what the planet has always been. But they no longer feel like signs of disorder. They begin to appear as parts of a process, as interactions that contribute to something larger, something that does not rely on stillness to exist. The same forces are still present. Heat rises, pressure builds, energy moves through air and water, shaping conditions that continue to evolve. Life persists within these movements, interacting with them, influencing them, becoming part of the balance that forms through their connection. Nothing has been added, nothing has been removed, and yet everything feels redefined. The randomness that once seemed to dominate the system begins to fade into something more structured, not because it has changed, but because its patterns have been recognized. The instability that once suggested a lack of balance now appears as part of how balance is created, not as its opposite, but as one of its necessary elements. This is where the realization begins to settle. The system has always been what it is. It has always moved, always adjusted, always carried itself forward through interactions that do not stop. The difference is not in the system itself, but in how it is understood. The perception shifts from seeing separate events to seeing connection, from seeing disruption to seeing transformation, from seeing instability to seeing process. And within that shift, something quiet begins to emerge, a sense that nothing needed to change for this understanding to exist. The system did not become more organized, did not suddenly reveal something new. It simply continued as it always has, while the way it is observed began to deepen. This creates a different kind of completion, not one that ends the story, but one that reshapes it. Because the beginning and the present are no longer separate ideas. They are part of the same continuous process, connected by interactions that never stopped, even when they were not fully understood. The chaos of the past becomes part of the balance of the present. The patterns of the present extend into what comes next. And all of it exists within the same system, unchanged in its function, but transformed in its meaning. The idea settles gently. Nothing about the earth has changed in this moment, but the way it is seen has. And in that change of perspective, the story begins to move toward its final realization, not by adding something new, but but by bringing everything together into a single, continuous understanding. The system continues, whether it is noticed or not. Long before any awareness could observe it, the atmosphere moved, the oceans shifted, the land formed and reformed, and the balance that holds everything together emerged through interactions that did not require recognition. Nothing within that process depended on being seen. Nothing waited to be understood. It simply unfolded. Across vast stretches of time, the same forces acted, shaping conditions, adjusting to change, maintaining continuity through movement that never paused. Life appeared within this system, not as its center, but as part of its expression, influenced by it, and in turn influencing it. And eventually, something capable of observing it all began to ask questions. But the system did not change because of those questions. It did not begin to operate differently, did not shift its processes to align with awareness or intention. It continued, just as it always had, moving through each moment without reference to the presence of those who experienced it. This is where the perspective begins to widen. The balance that exists does not belong to any single part of the system. It is not held by one force, not controlled by one influence, not defined by one presence. It emerges from the interaction of everything, from processes that extend far beyond any single point of awareness. And within that vast interaction, humanity exists, not outside of it, not above it, but within it, as part of the same system that has always been in motion. The actions that arise from human presence become part of the balance, just as the movements of air and water do, just as the shifts of land and the persistence of life always have. But participation is not ownership. The system does not belong to those who exist within it. It is not something that can be held, directed, or defined by a single perspective. It continues beyond any one presence, shaped by interactions that do not center around a single point. This realization does not arrive as something forceful. It settles gradually as the scale of the system becomes clearer, as the continuity of its movement reveals how little it depends on any one part within it. The balance that exists today was not created for those who experience it now. It formed long before through processes that did not require awareness to unfold. And it will continue. Not because it is preserved, but because it is maintained through the same interactions that have always carried it forward. The system does not pause for any presence within it. It does not begin or end based on who observes it. It moves on its own terms. This changes how the story is understood. It is no longer centered on a single perspective, no longer shaped around the idea that the system exists for those within it. Instead, it becomes something larger, something that includes every presence without belonging to any one of them. The Earth's balance is not something given. It is something that emerges. And within that emergence, every force, every interaction, every form of life becomes part of what it is without defining it entirely. The idea settles quietly. This balance was never ours. It is something we became part of. And in that understanding, something softens. The need to place everything at the center of one perspective begins to fade, replaced by a sense of being within something far larger, something that continues whether it is noticed or not. The system does not ask to be understood. It does not require recognition. It simply continues. And as that continuity becomes clearer, the story moves toward its final reflection, carrying with it the understanding that what has been described is not something separate from the present, but something that continues to unfold beyond any single moment, beyond any single point of view. The Earth turns. It does so quietly, without announcement, without pause, moving through space in the same steady motion it has always carried. Light reaches its surface again, spreading slowly across oceans, across land, across everything that exists within the system that has never stopped adjusting. Nothing about this moment feels unusual. The sky brightens, the air shifts, the world settles into patterns that feel familiar, as though they have always been this way. And in a sense, they have the same processes that shaped the earliest days continue here, now unfolding in ways that connect the distant past to what is experienced in the present. The light does not arrive for the first time. It returns. It touches the surface just as it has for billions of years, carrying energy that moves through the atmosphere, through the oceans, through the land. becoming part of the same interactions that have always defined the balance of the planet. And that balance continues. Not as something completed, not as something finished, but as something in motion, something that forms and reforms with every passing moment. The system does not reach an endpoint. It does not arrive at a final state where change is no longer needed. It continues. The air moves, the water flows, the land shifts, life persists, and within all of it, the balance holds. Not because it is fixed, but because it is maintained through interactions that never stop. This is where the story settles, not into an ending, but into a moment. A moment that feels complete, yet carries within it everything that has come before, and everything that will follow. The early chaos, the gradual patterns, the emergence of life, the disruptions, the adjustments, all of it remains part of what exists now, woven into the system that continues to move forward. Nothing has been left behind. Everything continues. The same forces act, the same interactions unfold, the same balance forms, again and again, without pause. The present is not separate from the past. It is part of it, and the future is not waiting somewhere ahead. It is already unfolding within this movement. The idea settles softly. There is no final answer, no point where the system is fully understood, no moment where the story reaches a conclusion that holds everything in place. The balance is not something that can be completed. It is something that continues, shaped by processes that do not stop, guided by interactions that do not end. And within that continuation, something becomes clear. The story itself does not end. It moves forward, just as the system does, carrying everything within it into the next moment, and the next without ever fully closing. The earth turns. The light continues to arrive. The balance continues to form. And all of it unfolds quietly, steadily, without the need for an ending, without the need for a final explanation. Because this is not a story that has finished, it is a story that is still happening, even now, even here. And as the world continues its slow, steady movement beneath the light that has never stopped reaching it, the story remains open, carrying itself forward into whatever comes next, without conclusion, without end, simply continuing, just as it always has.